Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Michael Grace, and this is episode 12 of the KMG Show. I think I'll start off today with some breaking news involving everyone's favorite permanent senator, Chuck Schumer, the great state of New York. According to Fox News, Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, on Wednesday issued a highly unusual and forceful rebuke to Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, calling his seemingly threatening remarks directed at Associate Justices Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh irresponsible and dangerous, prompting Schumer's office to slam Roberts and accuse him of bias. The extraordinary back and forth began hours earlier at a pro-choice rally hosted by the Center for Reproductive Rights, when Schumer ominously singled out President Trump's two Supreme Court picks, quote, "I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions." Roberts replied in his remarkable written statement obtained by Fox News this morning. Senator Schumer spoke at a rally in front of the Supreme Court while a case was being argued inside. Schumer referred to two members of the court by name and said he wanted to tell them that you have released the whirlwind and you will pay the price. You will not know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions. Justices know that criticism comes with the territory, but threatening statements of this sort from the highest levels of government are not only inappropriate, they are dangerous. All members of the court will continue to do their job without fear or favor from whatever quarter. Schumer's spokesman, Justin Goodman, quickly responded by accusing Roberts of bias, further escalating the confrontation. Quote, "Women's healthcare rights are at stake, and Americans from every corner of the country are in anguish about what the court might do to them." Senator Schumer's comments were a reference to the political price Senate Republicans will pay for putting these justices on the court, and a warning that the justices will unleash a major grassroots movement on the issue of reproductive rights against the decision. For Justice Roberts to follow the right wing's deliberate misinterpretation of what Senator Schumer said while remaining silent when President Trump attacked Justices Sotomayor and Ginsburg last week shows Justice Roberts does not just call balls and strikes. That was an apparent reference to Trump's call for those liberal justices to recuse themselves from some cases due to alleged bias. So let's look at this statement that Schumer made. He said, "I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions." Now, if Schumer meant to say that the Republican Party would pay a steep political price for its lack of support for what is amusingly called reproductive rights, then he expressed himself ineptly, to put it best, and he should have qualified his remarks and apologized for the fact that any straight reading of that implies a physical threat to both Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. Now, I suppose the Democrats have come to terms with the fact that they are not going to have control of the Supreme Court for quite some time, although there has been talk about them impeaching justices, presumably for making the wrong decisions. Now, this grassroots movement of which Schumer spoke of, again, there has been talk, apart from the Democrats packing the court, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt threatened to do in the 1930s, that is to say, to raise the number of justices from 9 to 15 and just say, appoint 6 extra ones at one time so that they would have a supermajority. But the Democrats, the media, the elite have depended upon the courts, the critarchy, as Vidar likes to call it, for decades. And now they've lost it. So what to do? Well, one of the things that they can do is to paint the Supreme Court of the United States as illegitimate. illegitimate because there are the wrong justices on it issuing the wrong decisions. Now, this is all quite amusing because, of course, for decades, the Democrats have spoke of the Supreme Court as, I don't know, religious men might talk about Jesus's apostles. They're living apostles who interpret a living constitution. But in a way, this is good news because it demonstrates once again that the Democrats have completely lost their rag, that they are out of control. We had Donna Brazile, the purple-haired lesbian, shouting, just shut the hell up at the woman who runs the Republican National Committee the other day. Donna Brazile, you will remember in 2016, got debate questions from CNN and passed them on to the DNC in order to help out Hillary Clinton. And she was rewarded for this by a slot on Fox News. Now, Biden is totally demented, says Chocokin666. We'll get to that, well, right now. Right now. I don't know. I suppose I should have seen this coming. I mentioned earlier in the week that I owe Kyle Rowland an apology because he picked Biden, and I thought, no, that is not going to happen for all sorts of reasons, but it all happened so fast. The rumor is that President Obama intervened behind the scenes so that everyone drops out except for Liz Warren, and one wonders how long she'll be in the race. And then you have the 78-year-old versus the 79-year-old. And, well, the market certainly approves. Let's see, CNBC, Dow soars more than 1,100 points as market rallies off Biden win. United Health pops 10%. So I guess the racket that is healthcare in the United States, the criminal cartel, which is healthcare in the United States, feels a lot better now that Joe Biden is the likely Democratic nominee. Of course, I should caution people that, I wrote about markets for several years, and it was always, I always got to laugh that at the end of every day, the Dow goes up or the Dow goes down, and it's always attributed to a specific cause. And of course, there's no one specific cause which causes the market to go up and down. It is the decision of many thousands of people, as well as computer bots. But no, there must be a simple human explanation for everything that happens in the world. And according to CNBC, stocks surged on Wednesday as major victories from former Vice President Joe Biden during Super Tuesday sparked a massive rally within the healthcare sector. So let's look at that victory. I'm looking at the results here from Politico. Joe Biden won 10 states, including Texas. Bernie Sanders won the largest prize of the night, California. Delegates, 512 for Biden, 441 for Sanders, 284 still to be awarded, and the also-rans, that is to say Bloomberg, Warren, and Gabbard have 53, 53, and 1. Joe Biden absolutely crushed Sanders in Alabama with over 63% of the vote. Similarly, he more than doubled his vote total in Virginia. North Carolina was a little closer. Tennessee, 41-25. Arkansas, a state in which Biden has not campaigned in, he won 41-22. Oklahoma, he won 38-25. Now, Oklahoma is amusing to me for the reason that we all know that Senator Elizabeth Warren, who represents the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, was born and raised in Oklahoma. And of course, she later claimed to be a Cherokee Indian, which was most useful to her in getting hired and getting tenure at Harvard University. And she contributed recipes to a powwow cookbook. Also, her husband, Bruce Mann, another Harvard professor, also claimed to have Cherokee blood. These claims were exploded, and Elizabeth Warren walked back from them. But it would appear that there is no love lost for Elizabeth Warren in Oklahoma. Now, a shock for me is that in Minnesota, home of the Scandicucks, Bernie won rather handily, 39 to 30%. Now, Texas, it was a little closer, 34.5% to 34%. Now, supposedly, the Hispanics loved Bernie to death. The Hispanics were feeling the burn, but not so much, not enough to ensure victory at any rate. Maine, again, a surprise that Biden wins 34.1 to 32.9. Maine is almost right next door to Vermont. And Maine is like New Hampshire, as they like to say, not representative of the United States as a whole. Massachusetts, Sanders lost, and Biden won easily, 33.6% to 26.7%. Oh, and who's in third place? Elizabeth Warren with 21.4%. She's a two-term senator from Massachusetts, and she finished third in her home state. Vermont, Sanders won. That's his home state. He more than doubled Biden's total. Colorado, Sanders won 36 to 24%. In Utah, 35% to 17%. And in California, 34% to 25%. Of course, they're still counting ballots in a whole bunch of these states. This is just so fishy, so absolutely fishy. Apparently, in California and in Colorado, there were lineups, polling stations, hundreds of people waiting long past the polls were supposed to have closed. I suppose one could ascribe this to incompetence, and that's a large part of it, but I also suspect fraud. I'll mention again that my country of Canada has roughly the same population as the state of California, although it is spread out over the world's second largest country. And our elections are known generally by about 9 or 10 Pacific time. I mean, they are locked in. There is no enormous amounts of later ballots to be counted, to be harvested, as they like to say. That California, again, seems to be at a tipping point. The things that one associates with the first world, for instance, the ability to count ballots in a timely manner, there's so many other things, they just seem to be slipping away from California as it becomes Mexico Norte. So let's look at the popular vote, keeping in mind, again, that a large part of it, of Super Tuesday's votes, remains to be counted. But Biden is ahead over 900, he's ahead 916,000 votes. That is to say 4.8 million to 3.9 million. Warren, third at 1.8 million, and Bloomberg, who was a late challenger, almost the same at 1.7 million. So who voted for whom? Well, let's look at the Washington Post's exit poll. Amongst white voters, Sanders got 27%, Biden 34%, Bloomberg 12%, Warren 15%. Amongst black voters, Sanders got 17% and Biden got 57%. I don't know that I want to racialize this, but it seems that black people are simply not going to vote for Bernie Sanders. They just, there's no attraction there. amongst Hispanic Latino voters, who curiously among Asian voters, 42% for Sanders and only 13% for Biden. Steve Saylor says it's possible the Hispanic plurality for Bernie is largely a function of Latino voters being younger because the generation gap among Democrats is huge. So it's clear that Biden's rather spectacular triumph yesterday is due to a high-low coalition, specifically a coalition of boomers who are rich and black people who are poor. So amongst voters 18 to 29, Sanders got a whopping 61%, with Biden at 17. Among voters 30 to 44, Sanders 43 to Biden 23. Among voters 45 to 64, and that appears to be the tipping point, 45, Sanders 20%, Biden 42%, and 65 or older, Sanders 15%, Biden 48%. You may have seen this meme that the Biden people and their friends in the media have been pushing for several years, is that Joe Biden is the 70s hipster par excellence. In fact, I read somewhere that someone has started writing detective novels starring Obama and Biden, where they drive around in Biden's vet solving crimes. And the Biden campaign last night put out a clip with Joe Biden speaking at a terribly embarrassing session, I believe, at the New York Times, before the New York Times editorial board, saying, talking about his health, his age, blah, 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 blah. I'm not gonna die. Maybe that's why the boomers love Biden so much, because he's internalized the boomer idea that I'm not going to die, ever. Something is going to come up. Some Pfizer is going to come up with some minty gel, which is going to cheat death's sting. So I can keep on booming forever. Yep, just keep on riding that RV across the country and complaining about not getting a sufficient discount, etc., etc., etc. Now, Biden, they call him Mr. Gaff, or variations on that. We're not talking about gaffes here. Everyone makes gaffes. We're talking about senile dementia. He doesn't seem to know what office that he is running for, or when Obama was president, what state he's in, what day it is. He called it Super Thursday the other day. He confused his wife with his sister up on the dais last night at the victory celebration. His wife was to his right, and his sister was to his left, and he got them mixed up. And then, if that weren't enough, he said, "I'm married to Joe." Now, if Joe Biden were a very high IQ fellow, the archetypal absent-minded professor, one could understand that sort of thing. But Joe Biden is a midwit at best. And what has his profession been? His profession has been talking. That's all he's ever done in his life. He has spent, tens of thousands of hours talking. That's what he's supposed to be good at. Joe Biden was born in 1942. He's not a boomer. He is even older than that. So when did he first run for office? Let's see, he's practicing law in the late 1960s. So he ran as a Democrat in 1969 for Newcastle County Council. 1969. So he was, he was 26 years old when he first ran for public office. He was first elected to the Senate in 1972 when he was 29 years old, and he has spent the decades, the almost 50 years since then, just talking, and he finds it difficult to spit out a single sentence that makes any sense at all. And golly, I remember when Ronald Reagan was president during his second election, when he was running against Walter Mondale, and he was asked this question, and thankfully for him, it was the last question of the debate, and he went into this long, rambling answer about driving alone on the Pacific Coast Highway, and I just thought, shut this down. And thankfully, it did get shut down. It seems clear that Reagan was in and out during his second term, but of course, Joe Biden is in and out, that is to say, in terms of compos mentis, most of the time, and he is not even president yet. And the media has decided that, we're just not going to get into that, really, because, I mean, what would be the point of getting into it? Because, you know, we've decided that this is the guy who's going to win. And since he's going to win, we're just going to ignore this. They've got away with it so far because he hasn't been running against Trump yet. But Trump started bashing him for his obviously feeble mind last night. And there's going to be no end to it. You remember in 2016, Hillary Clinton was attending some function, perhaps a memorial, and she was walking back to her, what was alleged to be a hospital vehicle, perhaps with a hyperbaric chamber, you know, the one that Michael Jackson famously used. And just before she got in, she collapsed. And we're lucky that there was someone there with a capturing device. Otherwise, the media would have simply killed the story that she was picked up and thrown into the van like a sack of potatoes. And the media decided, there's no news here. Nah, we're not going to go with that. Later that weekend, her campaign said, oh, no, never mind. She has pneumonia. Oh, pneumonia, that's not a serious illness. It's not as if pneumonia is pretty much the leading cause of death amongst old people. But no, it's just pneumonia. So, yeah, it's just too funny. I suppose even more this year than in 2016, the media is not going to be able to get away with this because everything is filmed. And of course, one doesn't need to go to the mainstream media to get one's news anymore. Increasingly, people get their news from YouTube and Twitter, which means that instead of, half a dozen gatekeepers, there aren't any gatekeepers anymore. For the second time in this campaign, Jill Biden, she styles herself Dr. Jill Biden. She doesn't even have a PhD, let alone an MD. She has a education degree. Okay. She defended her husband, looking quite ferocious, from one of these PETA crazies who was talking about the iniquity of cows being impregnated in order to give milk for humans to drink and to be made into butter and other dairy products. What's with these Democrats? They don't have security. They have Secret Service, surely. Have they been given orders not to deal quickly and efficiently with people who rush the stage? Joe Biden is at such an age were he to be knocked down even accidentally, and were to say smack his head on the stage, that could have serious or even fatal consequences. Now, let's talk about Mike Bloomberg. Mike Bloomberg won some delegates from, he won most of the delegates from American Samoa. Yeah. And God knows how much money he spent. But I'm just thinking it's going to be really sad in American Samoa because there's going to be a cargo cult. A man came to our islands. He was a short man. He was called Mike. And he was so generous. There was money for everyone, more money than we had ever seen. And then he disappeared. And there was no more money. When will Mike come back? Perhaps if we make a podium for him, a very short podium, and then Mike will come back. Perhaps if we chant to our ancestors, then Mike will come back and the wealth will flow again. Mike Bloomberg spent anywhere from $500 million to $1 billion, supposedly, on his campaign, which lasted for, 3 weeks? A month? And one debate? I saw a bunch of people on Twitter yesterday saying, yeah, well, he still has more money than Trump. Yes, he does. Yes, he does. He started off with 60 billion. So let's say he has 59 billion now. Whereas Donald Trump, according to the latest Forbes estimate, has something like $3.2 billion. When you're talking about amounts of money that huge, I don't know, that there's all that much difference. I suppose, unless you want to take over countries, right? Become some sort of warlord. But it seems to me one of the points of having $60 billion is that you can pay not to be humiliated in public. And Mike Bloomberg paid a rather substantial amount to be embarrassed, to be shamefully embarrassed in public. Now, I hope, from what I've read, that the campaign people, even the low-level political operatives who'd been hired by Bloomberg's campaign, were being paid unheard of amounts of money, something $800, $1,000 a week, and they were given everything. They were given accommodation, free food, free booze, free transportation, free expenses, and this wasn't primary to primary, as is typical with low-level operatives. This was guaranteed, supposedly, right up to Election Day. Now, I certainly hope that Mini Mike keeps his promise so that his campaign workers will get their excellent salaries and their avocado toast and their appletinis into November. Yes, he endorsed Biden. Everyone's endorsing Joe Biden because, let's see. What does Mike have to say? I've known Joe for a very long time. I know his decency, his honesty, and his commitment to the issues that are so important to our country, including gun safety, healthcare, climate change, and good jobs. Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar both exited the race between the South Carolina primary on Saturday and Super Tuesday and chose to back Biden, along with Beto O'Rourke. Yes, Beto, otherwise known as Robert Francis Aloysius O'Rourke. Yes, it's a more Irish name. It would be difficult to imagine, but I guess there's not much cachet in being Irish anymore. And so O'Rourke decided to make himself into a fake Hispanic, rather as Liz Warren made herself into a fake Native Indian. So Liz Warren is, at least as of a couple of hours ago, or last time I checked, still in the race. According to Politico, Warren team turns grim after Super Tuesday wipeout. Her campaign has massive overhead, and she's facing hard political and financial decisions about whether to keep going. 3 weeks ago, the campaign said that it was poised to finish in the top 2 in 8 of the 14 states that vote on Super Tuesday. She didn't in any, including her home state of Massachusetts. California votes are still being counted, but she is currently running a distant 4th. This past weekend, the campaign analysts predicted the field winnowing would redound to Warren's benefit. It didn't. The campaign also has financial constraints that come with a unionized staff of over 1,000 people, the largest field operation in the race besides Mike Bloomberg's, even after raising $29 million in February. Well, you see, she just doesn't have the political noose of Joe Biden, who, let's put it bluntly, this is Joe Biden's 3rd go-round. And it wasn't until South Carolina on Saturday that he had won a single primary or caucus, which suggests to me that he is a bad candidate. But miraculously, everyone's all turned around on Joe Biden now. Again, he didn't even campaign in most of these Super Tuesday states. As I reported a few days ago, his California office, now he didn't win California, but he finished 2nd, so he'll pick up a bunch of delegates. He had one office in the entire state of California, and it was in East LA, and reporters got there at 9 o'clock in the morning, and it was padlocked shut. So I don't know. It's just the less people see of Joe Biden, the more they like him. Of course, the converse there is that the more people have seen of Liz Warren, the less they have liked her. Here's a piece by Robbie Soave in Reason. As Super Tuesday finally transfigures the Democratic presidential nomination process into a binary choice between 2 old, occasionally problematic white men, oh boo, white men, whose enduring popularity is consistently underrated by a baffled mainstream press, it's worth reflecting on just how poorly the media's preferred candidates performed in the 2020 race. Yeah, what was the appeal with Liz Warren anyway? Because as I said, quite seriously, she is like Hillary Clinton without the charm. She is like that 11th grade social studies teacher that you had that everyone hated. In the end, Soave writes, the New York Times dual Democratic presidential endorsements. I mean, can't you pick one? Oh, you wouldn't want to leave any of the women out except you, Tulsi. We're not including you, and I'll get to Tulsi in a minute. Bestowed upon both Senators Elizabeth Warren and A.B. Klobuchar, who were like the points on whose line is it anyway, they just didn't matter. Nor did the media's fawning over South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg, early flirtation with Beto O'Rourke, the absolute worship of Senator Kamala Harris resonate with the millions of America living outside the Acela corridor. Indeed, the media stumped for Warren so hard that Vox's Matt Iglesias recently had to write a post explaining to people why she was losing, even if all your friends love her. By your friends, he meant friends of people like you, a reader of Vox. Iglesias famously described Vox's audience as, quote, a graduate of or student at a selective college, which also describes the staff and our social peers, quote unquote, and lamented that if you assign me the job of serving a less educated audience, I probably need to think about how to change things up. Now, you may have seen that Vox is in severe financial difficulty. And again, what is Vox's audience? Is it people like Matt Iglesias for the elite and the aspirational class? Well, mostly, just the elite, because not all of the aspirational class gets into selective colleges, as Matt did. Well, I mean, you've got the New York Times for that. They've got that beat covered. The Washington Post has that beat covered. The Economist has that beat covered. But with Vox, well, you get the added snark, and you get the added millennial triumphalism. At present, so of rights, Biden and Sanders are locked in a battle for delegates. Both men have a good shot at the nomination, but this was true a year ago as well. They were both better known and better liked than many in the media seem to grasp, and an endless series of magazine covers, fluff pieces, and editorial board endorsements aimed at other candidates couldn't make any difference whatsoever. Well, that's half true. Bernie Sanders is liked or loved by a substantial amount of people. He's also loathed and feared by a substantial amount of people. Joe Biden doesn't inspire strong emotions in anyone and never has. That's why his first two presidential campaigns went nowhere. And Joe Biden reminds me of another presidential candidate who took 3 trips to finally get the nomination, and that was Bob Dole. Remember him? It was finally his turn in 1996. And guess what? He got seen off by Bill Clinton, despite Clinton's many scandals, really easily because, Bob Dole, war hero, been in the Senate forever. Joe Biden, not a war hero, in the Senate forever, even longer than Bob Dole. Nobody particularly likes Joe Biden, although, you know, we are going to hear an awful lot of lies in the next few months about just how well loved Joe Biden is. And, you know, we've already seen some of it, that his creepy behavior with women and children, he's just a handsy kind of guy. Well, Chris Matthews wasn't a handsy kind of guy. Chris Matthews was just sort of a talky, flirty kind of guy, and he got sacked. And apparently he is one of the worst people on earth. But with Joe Biden, and there he was nuzzling some baby, just this week that was caught on camera. He can't, I don't know, I mean, just a bit before my time, the cliche is that candidates kissed babies. And okay, there's the baby, kiss it on the cheek, you move on. This weird nuzzling thing that he does, it's all too much. Now, I don't think that Joe Biden has a chance to win of course, you know, technically he has a chance to win the election in November, but let's assume for the sake of argument that he does. If he does, and I would say before then, starting right now, people are going to start paying close attention to the 25th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Now, this amendment was thought to be necessary because the Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6 of the Constitution reads, in the case of the removal of the president from office or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president. Well, there was a lot of ambiguity there. So this is what the amendment says. In the case of the removal of the president from office or of his death or resignation, the vice president shall become president. Whenever there's a vacancy in the office of the vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both houses of Congress. Whenever the president transmit to the president pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives his written declaration that he is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, and until he transmits to them a written declaration to the contrary, such powers and duties shall be discharged by the vice president as acting president. Whenever the vice president and majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments or of such other body as Congress may by law provide, transmit to the president pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives the written declaration that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the Vice President shall immediately assume the powers and duties of the office as acting President. Thereafter, when the President transmits to the President pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives his written declaration that no inability exists, he shall resume the powers and duties of his office unless the Vice President and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive department or of such other body as Congress may by law provide transmit within 4 days to the President pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives their written declaration that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. Thereupon, Congress shall decide the issue, assembling within 48 hours for that purpose, if not in session. If the Congress, within 21 days after receipt of the latter written declaration, or if Congress is not in session, within 21 days after Congress is required to assemble, determines by 2/3 vote of both houses that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the Vice President shall continue to discharge the same as acting President. Otherwise, the President shall resume the powers and duties of his office. Well, I cannot foresee a situation whereby the President of the United States says, yeah, I'm just not up to being President for whatever reason. I'll get back to you. Meanwhile, my loyal Vice President will assume my duties. No, there's no comeback from that. There is no possible comeback from that. After Reagan was shot, or after he had his prostate operation, you know, if he was not up and around within a few days, that would have been the end. He would have been replaced by George Bush the first. You can't have a situation where, oh, this is the president. Well, not right now. When is he going to come back? Well, you know, sometime he'll come back. No, the markets wouldn't stand for it. The people wouldn't stand for it. Why am I talking about this? This has happened in the past. Let's talk about Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, he's famously known or reviled as the man who lied America into war. He campaigned in 1916 on a very strong anti-war platform, and then he changed his mind in 1917. Now, he became very ill, Woodrow Wilson did, in his second term, and the President of the United States was effectively a woman called Edith Bowling, second wife of Woodrow Wilson. He married her in 1915. I'm reading from Wikipedia here. Edith Wilson is notable for the influential role she played in President Wilson's administration following the severe stroke he suffered in October 1919. For the remainder of her husband's presidency, she managed the office of the president, a role she later described as stewardship, and determined which communications and matters of state were important enough to bring to the attention of the bedridden president. Needless to say, the American media were not informed about this. The people of the United States were not informed about this. In 1944, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was running for his unprecedented fourth term, it was clear that he was seriously ill. Claire Booth Luce, who was a congresswoman, an ambassador, hit playwright, she was the second wife of Henry Luce, the founder of the Time Life Empire. She caused a sensation during the 1944 election when she said that it was obvious that Roosevelt was dying. And this was thought to be in extreme bad taste because one wouldn't want to bring up, you know, the fact that the president of the United States is dying simply because the United States was engaged in a war with both Japan and Germany. And this was kept secret, so secret that, you know, Truman was shocked. Everyone was shocked. Truman knew nothing about the Manhattan Project. about the atomic bomb, because I guess Franklin Delano Roosevelt, like Joe Biden, believed that he was going to live forever. I mean, if you see him, in these wartime conferences, the later ones, I mean, he looks like a walking skeleton. I mean, it is really quite shocking. So, there are people talking now about the possibility of Joe Biden getting the nomination in order to see off Bernie, who we've just learned apparently for the first time is a as dangerous communist, because he kept that secret. Well, no, he didn't, but I suppose the media wasn't all that interested in it. We're talking about the possibility now of Biden getting the nomination and then being pushed out, and then someone will come to the rescue. Hillary, perhaps, but who is going to be Joe Biden's vice presidential pick? Now, there was talk about this frightening woman from Georgia called Stacey Abrams. The high point in her career was that she was the Senate minority leader in Georgia. She ran for governor of Georgia in 2018, and of course she was going to win because her and Beto were both going to win. Well, guess what? They both lost, despite the fact that Stacey Abrams is less qualified for the office of vice president than Sarah Palin was. She is considered to be a serious candidate for vice president. I heard someone suggest today a member of the squad, such as Rashida Tlaib. I don't see that, because Rashida Tlaib cannot keep hidden her hatred of the United States of America. I mean, she simply can't. It just oozes out of her pores and often comes out of her mouth. Also, AIPAC and the like would simply, they wouldn't permit it. They wouldn't permit such a woman like that to be given the nod. Perhaps one of those two brothers from Texas, the ones who look like aliens, one of them ran for president this time around. Someone like that. But it would seem to me that the person that's chosen is going to have to be substantially younger than Joe Biden and is going to have to be not white. But you can see how this raises the stakes. John Nance Garner, my favorite vice president, he famously said that the vice presidency was worth a pitcher of warm piss. John Nance Garner is my favorite vice president because he fought against Roosevelt's arrogant belief that he owned the Democratic Party. And most especially, I like John Nance Garner because in the election of 1940, he did not vote for Roosevelt. After his final day of vice president, he got on the train from Washington, D.C. to Texas, and he never returned to Washington again. But so anyone who is appointed, chosen by Joe Biden or his team to be the vice presidential candidate knows that he or she is going to become president. In fact, it seems that perhaps there is going to be more ferocious fighting over the Veep nomination than over the presidential nomination, which would be quite extraordinary. How is Joe Biden going to campaign for president now that he is the cynosure of all eyes? That everything he says now is going to be recorded. It's going to be weighed. And this stuff just can't be laughed off as a gaffe anymore. And of course, it's unavoidable that there is going to be more scrutiny. Well, let's just say scrutiny of his role in the Ukraine and in China, and the role of his crackhead, incestuous son, Hunter Biden, in both the Ukraine and China. And this is such a horrible story that what are they going to do? I mean, I joked during 2016 that the Democrats were going to use the old Roman technique on Hillary Clinton, that they were going to smother her with a pillow and then announce, sadly, with tears in her eyes, that she had died suddenly of a previously undetected respiratory ailment. Maybe that's what will happen, to Hunter Biden, or maybe that's what will happen to Joe himself. Because if Joe keeps being Joe, well, he's going to become a laughingstock, toot sweet. And one thing I know about politics for certain, which is that candidates can survive a lot of things. Barney Frank survived the knowledge that there was a male whorehouse being run out of his townhouse. Yeah, that one of his tricks was running a male prostitution ring out of his home. And Barney Frank survived that. But what politicians cannot survive is becoming a laughingstock. When that happens, it is truly all over. Yes, let's see. John Miller says, don't forget Biden's immense Ukraine and China ties, a huge liability. Senator Ron Johnson is already drafting a report. And of course, we have Attorney Durham on the case as well. Let's see. Halsey has 5 children. Well, that's good. I like to hear that. Alex DeLarge says, I have 20 kids all over town. I think he is not being entirely serious there. YouTube 13 says, Bloomberg Veep, then brain aneurysm revisits old lunch bucket. Well, yeah, I really think that, given that the Democratic Party, and as indicated by the hysterical rant by Chuck Schumer, they are at their wits' end. I quoted from this long, exhaustive Atlantic piece the other day, where the permanent government, aka the deep state, they understand that they're losing, that it's slipping away from them. They are losing control of the permanent government to Donald Trump, and they can't have that because the permanent government, well, it means that elections are largely meaningless, too, one. And two, it means that these people can slip back and forth, from the private sector to the public sector, burnishing their resume. Oh, yes, who is supporting Joe Biden, or who are the permanent government types who have attached themselves like limpets to the campaign of Joe Biden? Well, Susan Rice and Samantha Power are 2 of them. Samantha Power is the Irish banshee who's associated with all war all the time across all of the world. And of course, Susan Rice is not very far behind. John Brennan. Oh, and James Comey. You can see why the deep state chose Joe Biden eventually, because the way they see it, you're going to go back to the Obama years only better. Only better because Obama was a weak president who would rather watch basketball highlights than actually do anything. But, I'm sure he wanted to be in on the loop. He wanted to believe that he actually had something to do with the decisions that were made. I think with Joe Biden, the very fact that he's president, that he wakes up in the morning and someone calls him President Biden, who are you talking to? You, Joe. You're the president. Oh, yeah, I am the president. That's pretty good, isn't it? So, all of the vultures are swooping in because it's going to be like, it's going to be old home week. That, Brennan and Comey there in charge of, the domestic stuff. and Samantha Power and Susan Rice instead of the foreign stuff. It'll just be scandals all round and war, 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 faster, pussycat, kill, kill. It's a pretty grim possibility. But, Joe Biden is maybe his wife, Jill, Dr. Jill Biden. Maybe she will rise to the fore like Edith Wilson did. Or, look at Ronald Reagan's second term, that his wife, Nancy, with the aid of astrologers, had an enormous amount of importance. People like Donald Regan learned, that she is the boss. And, not to disagree with Nancy. In terms of, the health of the American Republic, this is all very distressing. But one looks at it in terms of what can be mined comedically. Oh, well, I mean, this is just absolutely outstanding. How could it, the Goblino brothers, Alex DeLarge, I'm trying to remember their names, these two Texans. One was mayor of, San Antonio, which has a famously weak mayor system where the city manager decides everything. They really look like aliens. One expects the words out of their mouths, first words out of their mouths to be, take me to your leader. But, okay. Let's move on to Tulsi Gabbard. Now, Tulsi won a delegate from American Samoa. Not really surprising, is it? Mike won most of the delegates because, he spent the money. He established, as I said, the cargo cult there. But because of the fact that Tulsi Gabbard has a delegate, she is supposed to take part in the next debate. Now, a woman called Xochitl Hinojosa, she had something to say about that. She said, we have 2 more debates. Of course, the threshold will go up. By the time we have the March debate, almost 2,000 delegates will be allocated. The threshold will reflect where we are in the race, as it always has. And the message is, tough dookie, Tulsi. We are not going to let you on that stage. So who is Xochitl Hinojosa? She is described as the communications director for the Democrats. Yeah. She has this terrifying Aztec name, but it would appear that there is no Indian blood in her. That she is, as Steve Saylor likes to say, a conquistador American. Now, how do you learn about people, when there's not much information? Well, were they married? Were they keen to let society know what a fine marriage they made? When they'll end up with a story in the New York Times, and I was lucky to find such a story from November 2015. And it announces that Xochitl Hinojosa and Eloy Martinez were married Saturday evening at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in Austin, Texas. The bride, 31, is the director of Coalitions Media in Brooklyn, overseeing Hispanic, Black, and women's media for the Hillary for America presidential campaign. She graduated from the University of the Incarnate Word in San Antonio. So she is a PR spiv. Okay. So it says the bride's father, a lawyer in Austin, is chairman of the Texas Democratic Party. Her mother is a lawyer in Brownsville. There's a saying attributed to Mark Twain, which I don't think really came from him, but I'm going to say it anyway, that lawyers shouldn't marry lawyers because it's incest and it produces more lawyers. The groom, 35, is the senior director of government relations at the American Gaming Association in Washington. He's a PR spiv, marrying a PR spiv. Until September, he was the outreach director of the Senate Democratic Steering and Outreach Committee in Washington. He graduated from Texas Lutheran University. He is the son of Connie Martinez and Eloy Martinez of San Antonio. The groom's mother retired as the secretary to the chief of police for the San Antonio Independent School District. His father is a welder for the city of San Antonio. They sound like fine people. The couple met in August 2009 during a Texans in D.C. reception that was hosted by a mutual friend. At the time, they were in other relationships. I first remembered him as being very friendly, very funny, and easygoing, Ms. Hinojosa said. We became a bit friendly for a while, but then we fell out of touch. She wasn't very friendly or receptive at all, Martinez said, laughing. Yeah, I guess the timing wasn't right for either of us. Their timing was much better 2 years later in October 2011, when they met again while watching a Dallas Cowboys game at a bar in Washington. This time, both were unattached. We were invited by mutual friends who strategically sat us next to each other, Zochtel said. I knew it was a setup, but he didn't, and though I was a bit nervous, I felt like I was in a real comfort zone in talking to a fellow Texan who liked football and politics. Indeed, they were soon hitting it off and bonding over other mutual loves like salsa music, country bands, and buffalo wings. You see these two PR spivs who have left Texas and made Washington their permanent home. They're just regular folks. They're like you and me. They love buffalo wings. Doesn't everybody? Country bands, salsa music. This time she was very receptive, and we got along very well, Martinez said. That she was a Texas Democrat made the situation that much better. Our being together just seemed to make a lot of sense. By the time he walked her home after the football game that night, Ms. Hinojosa was already in step with his thinking. In a big city, it's difficult to find people who you connect with that easily. Okay. Now, here's the money graph, the beta money graph. In November 2014, to celebrate Ms. Hinojosa's 30th birthday, they traveled to Italy over the Thanksgiving holiday. After a day of wine tasting in Tuscany, Mr. Martinez unveiled a 60-second proposal presentation he had created on his iPad. The soundtrack from the movie Love Actually, Ms. Hinojosa's favorite, played as pictures of Brad Pitt and other movie stars flashed across the small screen. And as he reminded her, she could have had any other man she wanted, but strangely, she was 30 years old and had never been married, which suggests rather the opposite. What? So this guy, that's the theme from Love Actually. And here's Brad Pitt and, I don't know, maybe George Clooney. And see, I'm not those guys, but maybe if you see pictures of those guys, you'll confuse me with those guys. And then came another photo, the engagement ring that Martinez planned to give Hinojosa when they returned home. He chose not to take it with him. It was not yet insured. Yes, he's a very sensible fellow. I saw the ring on his iPad before I saw it on my finger, Hinojosa said, but I loved it just the same. And I said yes, right on the spot. So you see how our ruling class lives. They can't make a proposal like a normal person. They have to create something on their iPad. And this is the woman who has decided that Tulsi Gabbard, the surfer mommy, is not going to be allowed to take part in the debate because, the rules change. When I feel like the rules should change. That's fair, right? I mean, no one would have any reason to complain about that. So, having an Aztec name, that is pretty intersectional, despite the fact that it would appear that she has no Indian blood. She gets to count as a person of color. But what does that mean, being a person of color? Is that a real thing? It would seem to be a real thing because it is much desired. But does it have any, substantive meaning? Does it have any, like scientific meaning? Well, that is a vexed question. Here's an essay from Professor Johnny E. Williams. He's a professor at Trinity College. I tweeted, "Whiteness is terrorism," and was condemned for it. Here's why I'm right. You see, the worst thing that you want to be is white, because apparently white people have all the power, all the influence, all the money, but everyone attacks them savagely, relentlessly, which suggests to me that they don't have all the power and all the influence, that they're rather at the bottom of that particular totem pole. So what is the justification, Professor Williams, Professor Johnny? The United States is a nation in which people who identify as white, scare quotes, preside over an oppressive system that everyone is expected to accept as normal. So when Indigenous, Black, Latinx, this has been explained to me, but it's so stupid that I keep forgetting it. What was wrong with, Latino? Well, what about the women? Well, if there are women, you could call them Latina, I suppose. And Asian folks refuse to abide by this inequitable and cruel way of organizing life. So cruel that this fellow gets paid to rant against whiteness in the Hartford Courant. He gets paid to attack white people at a private university in the United States for money. He continues, "For years now, I've been derided for inciting violence by those who think of themselves as white, because I dare to name and write about the sources of racially oppressed people's suffering, whites and their system of white racism. I was even investigated by my own institution, Trinity College, out of fear that the truth about whites and their systemic," boy, they love that word, systemic, "oppressive machinations may impact the thinking and actions of students, the public, and the institution's financial bottom line. Several months ago, a few alumni who aimed to smear me publicly yet again scoured my personal social media accounts like that never happens to anyone in the public eye. No, it's not as if someone put something on Twitter, used a bad word on Twitter when they were 15 years old, and then their livelihood is threatened. No, it only happens to people like Professor Johnny." So they were looking for posts to substantiate their belief that I hated people who think of themselves as white. Oh, I thought that had been established. In their haste to malign me, they revealed their ignorance regarding the idea of race, again in scare quotes, whiteness, and the system of oppression conventionally known as, wait for it, white supremacy. Now, if white supremacy actually existed, Professor Johnny would not be a professor at Trinity College or anywhere else, and he certainly wouldn't be invited into the Hartford Courant in order to say terrible things about white people. Anyway, race is often thought of as the idea that humans are naturally divided into biologically different groups. That's not correct. Race consists of shared patterns of seeing, thinking, and acting that validate and legitimize an existence of white identity and a white worldview. But there is no white race. Whiteness is a shared... Okay, there is no white race, but apparently racism exists. That apparently something like white supremacism exists. This is getting dangerously close here to Black liberation theology. That evil guy back in ye olden days who invented white people, remember that? He's typically shown with a gigantic brain, which is often throbbing in GIFs. Whiteness is a shared conglomeration of fabricated meanings and ideas about biologically insignificant human differences. Oh, really? So if one were to take, say, someone from Denmark and compare him to someone, say, from the Congo, we wouldn't recognize any significant human differences? I think we would, but this is only in one of the ways in which I differ from Professor Johnny. Whiteness only exists in relation or opposition to blackness and other fictitious racial categories created by whiteness adherents for the purpose of cementing a higher status and material advantage over other people that are excluded from being white. So I'm a little uncertain here as to whether he's saying that blackness is not a legitimate category. Then why is there a black congressional caucus? Why are Black Lives Matters, blackity black? There's tons and tons of black organizations. Now, obviously, the same objection against blackness as a catch-all category can be made to whiteness, because black people originally came from Africa, but Africa is a big, big place, and there are many, many different tribes which we conflate into being black. Black people around the world, there's a large admixture of whiteness in a great many of them. Many prominent black leaders in the past and to this day could easily pass as white, and people often have the experience of saying, "What, he's black? Seriously? He's supposed to be black?" But so the other racial categories, they're all bogus too? Then what's the organizing principle? How can people organize against whiteness if none of these categories exist? I think he's rather lost it here. He's lost the thread. That what he was attempting to say was that there are all these other legitimate categories, but then there's white people who don't exist, and despite not existing, they have seized all the power. Let's see. Another way of thinking of race is as a mythical political grouping that assigns human worth and status using the idea of skin color to legitimize their superior status. But it's not simply about physical features. In America, this concept is materialized into a very real system based on beliefs, values, behaviors, habits, and attitudes that results in actions leading to the unequal distribution of power and advantage. Whiteness separates those who are entitled to have advantages from those whose exploitation and vulnerability to violence is justified by their not being white. I guess that's why affirmative action exists, right? Because white people are determined to have all of the marbles. I guess that's why we must have, the first black this, the first black that, the first Hispanic this, the first Asian that, the first, disabled, lesbian, Asian, immigrant, etc., because white people are just determined to keep all of the power. Whiteness separates those who are entitled to have advantages from those whose exploitation and vulnerability to violence is justified by their not being white. You see, Professor Johnny can only get away with this because there is an unofficial ban on mentioning the truth about, shall we say, racialized crime statistics. People are kicked off YouTube and Twitter, other social media. It's just not done to simply quote from FBI figures. And that allows him to get away with this whopper that it is apparently black people who are afraid of white people and not the other way around. Whiteness is a position of power where people who imagine themselves to be white hold the power to decide who is white and who is not, who will and who will not prosper, and who will or will not live. Again, this is obviously false for the reason that there was a well-known phenomenon that lasted until, I suppose, the 1960s, the civil rights movement. It was called passing. And this was associated with the so-called one-drop rule. That if you had one drop, say black blood in you, then you were going to be found out, And there were people with, I don't know, 1/8, 1/4, sometimes, 1/2 black who they called themselves Italian, or said that they were Spanish or something like that, or, Creole or something like that. And so they passed for white in society. There's many famous examples. But the movement is all in the other direction now. That you have large numbers of people. Colin Kaepernick is a very good example of that. Kaepernick is he's majority white, except that he has chosen to identify as black full stop. Most of the professional athletes who were raised by white mothers, who are at least half and probably closer to 3/4 white, well, pretty much to a man, they identify as black because black is being seen as the strong horse and white is seen as the weak horse, to use the famous example of Osama bin Laden. Contrary to my critics' belief that whiteness is merely identity, race and whiteness materialize as systemic white racism, terroristic actions and practices with very real, tangible, and lethal effects. Whiteness often goes unnoticed by self-identified whites. Really, does it now? In ways that divert them from considering their complicity in the daily white terrorism. Wars, police, and military occupations, poor housing, health, and education directed at racially oppressed groups. Take, for example, offices of and policies filed under diversity, equity, and inclusion. These codify diversity to ensure self-identified whites never consider systemic remedies for white supremacy and contribute virtually nothing to addressing white racism as a system of oppression. On the other hand, they do give many, many jobs to people like Professor Johnny. Instead, they attempt to equip the racially oppressed with strategies for accommodating and coping with systemic white racism rather than eliminating it, which is a problem. Because what sustains white supremacy is not merely white people's unconscious thoughts and habits, but rather their active, conscious participation in creating and maintaining their systemic racial oppression. I'm not going to read any more from this, but white people are terrorists. And they commit systemic violence against non-whites every single day. Here it is again. Whiteness, by its very definition and operation as a key element of white supremacy, kills. It is mental and physical terrorism. This is what academics call eliminationist language. It's exceedingly dangerous because people read this sort of stuff and they act on it, as we have seen with Black Lives Matters. As we saw in the 1960s with the Black Panthers and other black radicals. But I guess the assumption is that, I don't know that white people are going to commit revolutionary suicide. Is that the idea? That one day they'll wake up and there's no white people because they've decided to go home, but they don't have any homes anymore because, of course, as we've been told, Ireland and Britain and France and Germany, they're black countries too now. So I guess the only way for this problem, this terrible problem of terrorism, systemic violence, is for white people to commit mass suicide. Well, I suppose Professor Johnny can hope, but I don't really think it's going to come to that. In fact, I'd rather suspect that we are pretty much coming to the end of this period in history where, oh, please forgive us for whatever it is we've done. Here's a bunch of stuff. Please stop hating us. We understand why you hate us, but what can we do? How can we grovel more? Let's see. Eche Lux says, when people say that whites need to die out, I always tell them, be the change you want to see in the world. Yes. Just so. No, I can't endorse that because suicide is a grave sin. It's the gravest sin. There are more benefits for identifying as black. Well, I mean, obviously, there's no question about that. I mean, I'm sure older viewers of this live stream will remember, when did this start? Like I say, in the 1970s, and it really picked up during the 1980s, that being white is boring. Particularly after that miniseries Roots, that, oh, what are your roots? And there's a lot of Americans, I suppose a majority, that could say, well, I have English blood, Scottish blood, Welsh blood, French blood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as opposed to, say, coming from a specific place on, the west coast of Africa. So white people's boring, white bread, vanilla. White bread is the most popular bread, and vanilla is the most popular ice cream. But, again, apparently white people are horrible. This is going to come to an end. And as far as Professor Johnny goes, look, this hustle has worked for him. So why would he stop? Why would he stop? I mean, this is extraordinary. That apparently to be white is to be a terrorist. And yeah, it's eliminationist language. He gets away with it. And time to move on. Just keep it up. See where it gets you. I don't think this is going to end well. Let's see, YouTube 13 says Bloomberg $500 million for 5 American Samoan delegates. Gabbard 1 delegate for about $1.380. Tulsi Gabbard, just the vitriol sprayed at her on social media. Some jokester, some comedian apparently said that she has dropped out of the race, or she's going to drop out of the race to endorse Putin. I mean, come on, that is just so hacky. Apart from the fact that, okay, the Democrats are the party of killing people now. And see, the Republicans are the bad party because they don't like killing people, killing foreigners with whom we have no quarrel. That the Republicans seem to be rather squeamish these days, or at least under Trump, about killing people with whom we have no quarrel. And if you're not in favor of killing strangers, who have done you no harm, which is traditionally interpreted, as murder, if you're not in favor of murder, if you're not in favor of mass murder, well, then you must be a Russian agent. This is where progressivism has led to. That it's, in 1972, George McGovern got stomped by Richard Nixon. And the result was that 4 years later, the Democrats decided that they had to go a different way. So they elected a self-styled peanut farmer from Georgia named Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter, he wore sweaters, cardigans in public, and he talked about how he had lusted in his heart after women. He seemed a very sensitive New Age guy. Actually, it turns out that when Jimmy Carter, well, his political accomplishment that he was a one-term governor of Georgia from 1971 to 1975. His nickname in the Georgia legislature was the Honey Badger. And we all know about the Honey Badger now because of that hilarious YouTube meme. So the Honey Badger is not shy and retiring. Danny Rose says, why do we try to understand them rationally? They are religious fanatics without God, and the only thing we should be seeking is to separate. Well, separation is difficult because I was talking last week about local separatism in the United States. A whole bunch of Virginia, these people who live there would rather be part of West Virginia than the state of Virginia because, of course, many American states, if not most of them, are dominated by a handful of large cities. Portland, of course, is dominated, Oregon is dominated by Portland and its suburbs. Seattle is dominated by King County. And, if you look at the geography of the state, the people who do not support those policies, they're like 80% of the land area, but population density is higher in the cities, so they rule. So, I mean, if you were really looking to separate, I suppose the United States would resemble what Germany resembled before its unification, a patchwork of perhaps hundreds of tiny statelets and principalities. Actually, I think that that's an ideal system, because under the old Germany, I mean, you saw this with Karl Marx and other figures. If they weren't welcome where they were, well, then they could literally walk 10 miles down the road to find a place which was more amenable. So let's talk about principled conservatism. Yeah, we had a similar thing in Canada. Principled conservatives, true conservatives. When you hear people saying things like that, what it means is, forget all your preconceived notions about what conservatism means, particularly your preconceived notion that it might have anything to do with, winning elections. No. We're purer than that, David Frum, yes, the author of The Axis of Evil. Great man, that David Frum. So someone named David Cleon, who I gather is quite a lefty, tweeted, "I'm not resigned to this, but if Biden does beat Trump, it might be the least worst scenario for the left, other than Bernie beating Trump, of course. He'll be a one-term caretaker surrounded by Obama veterans, maybe with pillows. Our generation isn't going anywhere. AOC turns 35 in 2024. David Frum responded, "The below is a true and public-spirited point. Get Trump out of power first, then have the argument over the future direction of the country. That's how never Trump Republicans think. We're sinking our policy preferences for the common cause. It's fair to ask others to do so too." And it's not. There's nothing venal in what David Frum is doing. It's not like he has a vested interest in the old crowd, the old guard, the people who were found wanting, the people who were left behind, coming back and taking over again. No. It's all public service with David Frum. I responded to him, "Never Trump Republicans, a real Algonquin roundtable you got there, David." It's just, in 2016, National Review ran this infamous Against Trump cover, and a whole bunch of people have clawed their way back, or tried to claw their way back from that. Glenn Beck was there. This is a real intellectual titan for you. Let's see, this is from Deborah Heine in American Greatness. "A number of America's leading Never Trump luminaries, including Bill Kristol, Evan McMullin, or Egg McMuffin, as he has been amusingly dubbed, Rick Wilson, Amanda Carpenter, Tom Nichols, Major Tom, and Ramesh Ponnuru, held a conference in Washington, D.C. on Saturday to an audience of about 200 supporters." I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Tickets, $10. Okay, so these are famous people within that sphere. Bill Kristol, Evan McMullin, Rick Wilson, Amanda Carpenter, Tom Nichols, Ramesh Ponnuru, and there were some others. Okay, these are the creme de la creme of Never Trumpism. Tickets were $10. They could only get 200 people. Time to compete with the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC. The Summit on Principled Conservatism was hosted by Principles First in partnership with Stand Up Republic, both of which describe themselves as grassroots organizations. Yes, AstroTurf, grassroots, they're the same thing. Principles First, founded by conservative consultant, PR Spiv, Heath Mayo. I've always maintained that name is obviously made up. Claims to be an entirely self-funded volunteer organization that is committed to rediscovering and championing principles in the 21st century. Stand Up Republic is a 501c4 nonprofit organization led by failed 2016 presidential candidate Evan McMullin and his running mate Mindy Finn to take down President Trump. Stand Up Republic is founded by eBay founder and left-wing financier Pierre Omidyar and the left-of-center Hewlett Foundation. The Omidyars have been amongst the most prolific supporters of left-wing causes for years, American Greatness reporter Julie Kelly pointed out in a groundbreaking report in November 2018. According to a 2014 report by the Media Research Center, Michael Bloomberg, Warren Buffett, Pierre Omidyar, Tom Steyer, and George Soros' son Jonathan are major funders of the left. Together, they have contributed at least $2.7 billion since 2000 to groups pushing abortion, gun control, climate change, alarmism, and liberal candidates. Omidyar has also donated millions to left-wing billionaire George Soros' pet projects, including the Open Society Foundations, a main funder of Planned Parenthood, the ACLU, and the Center for American Progress. The Open Society Foundations lists as its goals, quote, creating a pathway to citizenship for illegal immigrants, cutting the number of prison inmates by 50%, enacting comprehensive immigration reform, increasing welfare handouts, and raising taxes to redistribute wealth. Now, America has an awful lot of people in prison, and that is tragic. On the other hand, they're in prison for a reason. And the reason that so many Americans are in prison is that millions of Americans simply cannot find a way to coexist with their fellow Americans. They must needs resort to robbery, theft, assault, murder, etc. Now, one hears about the root causes, and certainly it would be good if those root causes were to be dealt with. But in the meantime, if people such as this are not sent to prison, then the streets quickly descend into anarchy. No principled conservatives would align themselves, American Greatness says, with someone who has dedicated his life to defeating conservative causes. But Bill Kristol, who actively opposes Republican candidates and tweets about his inner socialist, clearly is no longer a conservative if he ever was one. As someone who has literally written a book on these Never Trump grifters, Kelly was eager to attend their summit on principled conservatism and confront them face to face. She was joined by Human Events Editor-in-Chief Will Chamberlain and this reporter. Okay, so yeah, there was no shaking of hands, or people not shaking hands. Afterwards, Wilson, he said that Julie was even stupider in person than she looked. And then Kelly responded, well, you know, you had the opportunity to say this to me personally. And then she made a joke about Rick Wilson coming up to her shoulder blades. In other words, he's short. Now, that's interesting, don't you think? That there's all manner of differences in physiognomy we are not allowed to talk about. We're certainly not allowed to insult people about. But of course, you know, people have no choice in how tall or short they are. This is, you know, a function of genetics. Thankfully, I'm 5'11" myself, so you know I don't get called mini Kevin or short ass or any of those things. And certainly, I believe that we should be able to mock people for being short, especially if they're Rick Wilson or Mike Bloomberg. Yes, a principles first information packet included a list of 15 important principles to anchor our politics to core values, solid conservative principles like integrity, character, and virtue. Every person has quality, dignity, and worth. Truth, honesty, rationality, and facts are non-negotiable, and the Constitution and rule of law are paramount. It all sounds wonderful, but with Never Trump conservatives, it's always best to examine what their principles look like in practice. Rick Wilson is known for using degrading language to describe Trump supporters. Other principled conservatives on the panel referred to Trump supporters as crazies and cultists. At the most fundamental level, we are principled conservatives because we believe in the tremendous potential of every human being. You notice he doesn't say worth, he says potential. Human beings have worth even if they have no potential. But it's all about maximizing one's utility with these people, which demonstrates that they are in no way conservative. American Greatness says, of course, when most conservatives hear the term potential of every human being, they think about the unborn and how millions of potential human lives have been destroyed since abortion was legalized in 1973. But that does not seem to be a priority issue with principled conservatives like CNN contributor Tara Sethmeyer. Oh, this is a conservative thought that I've just been introduced to, who sat on the Politics of Conservative panel at the Principled Conservatism Summit. Sethmeyer praised extreme pro-abortion Democrat Pete Buttigieg on Sunday after he dropped out of the Democratic primary, calling him a breath of fresh air. Crystal's nonprofit advocacy group Defending Democracy Together also receives funding from Ahmadiyar and the Hewlett Foundation, gushed about Buttigieg's chances on CNN last fall. So, what do these, oh, yes, good, civility. Major Tom Nichols has been, there must be dozens of tweets from him in the last few months about how Trump supporters are stupid, that people who vote for the Republican Party are stupid, and that the problem with America is that it has an electoral system which allows stupid people to make decisions, such as who the president is going to be. This is the line that the left has adopted, and this is the line that the Never Trumpers have adopted because they are leftists. They started out as Trotskyites, and the reason why they were so enamored with George W. Bush is that Bush was a Trotskyite in the sense that he believed in permanent worldwide revolution. Not Americanism in one country, to paraphrase, but Americanism worldwide to be delivered at the point of a gun. And that's all they seem to believe in. That, oh my God, Trump is removing American troops from Afghanistan. Oh my God, Trump is going to pull out of Iraq. Oh my God, Trump is not committed, America, to endless war in Syria. And I'm sure they have a laundry list of half a dozen other countries, that America should be bombing into kingdom come. But as I say, this is the takeaway from this. Tickets, $10 to see the leading luminaries. Oh, I forgot Mona Charen. Mona Charen was there. I've been listening to Mona Charen for what, 40 years? Something like that. I can't remember a single word that woman has ever said. No, it would be more than 45 years, more like 45 years. These people are all essentially anonymous. They have found sinecures, and they are determined to keep those sinecures. David Frum, he left the establishment right, and now writes for The Atlantic, which used to be a respectable magazine. Now, the reason why David Frum has his perch at The Atlantic is because he is thought to represent a significant strand in American thought, that is to say, the Never Trump thought on the right. If Trump wins handily in the 2020 election in November, particularly if he takes back the House of Representatives, you're going to find these Never Trumpers don't have any purchase anymore because they clearly do not represent a significant strand in American political thought. In the same way that you don't really see very many libertarians who are given purchase anymore in the media. You don't see a lot of them on the panel shows, on the chat shows, because I suppose it was figured out that, as polls have shown, well, studies have shown, the libertarian thought has the support of roughly 1 to 3% of Americans. Now, it's useful to big business, but I suppose they were useful before globalism became fully known, before neoliberalism became fully known. And I think that the Never Trumpers are going to go the way of the libertarians. Uh, some of them have crawled back to the Democratic Party. I hope all of them crawl back to the Democratic Party because they were bad news right from the very beginning. Their primary interest is not in the United States. Their primary interest is in one, Israel, and two, Russia. And, to be frank, they have ethnic reasons overwhelmingly for hating Russia. This was disguised by anti-communism for decades, but Russia has not been a communist country since 1991. And they hate Russia more than they hated the Soviet Union, which demonstrates clearly where their priorities are. Oh, I see we have accusations of incel floating around in the chat. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Do we have to really get into that? I don't think we do. Wow, it's just flying back and forth. Let's see if we can find something on topic. John Miller says, UT and Alex, there's a huge savings glut. The deficits or bond creation is only invested by the top 5%. MMT is obfuscating the truth by saying it's for the 95%. Well, I'm not sure that I understand the reference there. There is an enormous amount of inflation in the United States. The stats have been juked that they use a basket, and the basket doesn't cover things like cost of college. It doesn't cover medical care. It doesn't count the things which have vastly increased in price. As what John Williams said, they used to measure, say, the cost of steak, and no, steak got too expensive, so let's measure the cost of hamburger. Eventually, they will be counting the cost of dog food. And this particularly delightful thing that Alan Greenspan came up with to determine, value based on worth. Now, anyone who has had to buy college textbooks or has paid for someone else's college textbooks or has been in a college bookstore, this is a jaw-dropping experience. How is it possible that a book that is being sold to thousands or tens of thousands of people could cost this much money? Well, it's a racket, but the science of hedonics tells us that college textbooks are actually not more expensive than they were in the past. You know why? Because they have more illustrations in them, and they often have color illustrations in them. So no, it's just wrong to think that they cost more than they did in the past. No, when there is an increase in the money supply, the money has to go somewhere. And where has it gone? It's gone into university, it's gone into housing, and it has gone into stocks. You used to hear about something called the price to earnings ratio when determining whether a stock or the stock market as a whole bore any relationship to reality. Well, you don't hear very much about the PE ratio anymore because, the government has helicoptered this money, and it has ended up in several places, one of which is in the equity markets. Now, I wanted to talk about geniuses. That are there fewer geniuses than there used to be? Do we need geniuses? I suppose that is a relevant question. That I commented a couple of weeks ago on a woman, I believe she's a PhD student, called Kathleen Rhodes. A lot of people commented on this. She had thousands of retweets of her tweet, which it says, want to know a secret? There are no irreplaceable geniuses. There are loads of geniuses out there. And actually, she had 4 O's in loads, so I'm not exaggerating. So if our resident rock star scientist turns out to be an asshole, we could just replace that person with someone who is both a genius and a good person. We totally could! Exclamation point. Yeah, it's really that simple. There's just they're just stacked up, all of these geniuses, and I've directed to a book by Bruce Charlton and Edward Dutton called "The Genius Famine." The authors explain the endogenous personality is the inner man, a person whose outlook on life is inward. He is inner-directed, inner-driven, inner-motivated, one who uses inner modes of thinking, inner evaluations, intuition. One who is to a high degree autonomous, self-sufficient, one who is relatively indifferent to social pressures, influences, and inducements. He stands in stark contrast to the exogenous personality, that is, to most people. The exogenous personality is oriented toward the environment, particularly the social environment. These are people who want more than anything else social, including sexual status, worldly success, people whose perceptions are directed outwards and who try to align their behavior with group norms. The endogenous personality might appear antisocial, uncooperative, a dreamer, not the kind of person we might wish to have to deal with on a regular basis. We would probably be accurate in perceiving the endogenous personality in this negative way. We probably wouldn't want to go for a drink with him, let alone be friends with him. But he is important. He is very important because the endogenous personality is the archetypal genius. Genuine breakthrough, world impact creativity is so rare, so difficult, far more difficult than commonly imagined, that it requires a special kind of mind, a mind especially designed for this kind of work, inner work. There need not be many such men. Indeed, there should not be too many, since the necessary mind is relatively unfit for the primary day-to-day activities of survival and reproduction of the species. But such men are needed sooner or later from time to time. Geniuses are for the good of the human group. They are people with a special gift for solving specially difficult problems, and all human societies are confronted sooner or later, and usually sooner, by the kinds of problems that can only be solved by geniuses, lacking which the problems are simply not solved. British mathematician Alan Turing, his cracking of the Enigma code, portrayed in the 2014 film The Imitation Game, is a case in point. This intensely difficult man had to struggle against head girl types to get a job for the government and then to build his code-cracking machine. Now, I'll say something else about genius. When people decide that, I could do better than anyone else, this indicates a dissatisfaction with the world as it currently exists. If the scientific principles, as stated, if they were sufficient, if literature was as good as it could be, or music, or anything else, then why would you want to do it? As I say, this comes from an appreciation of the world as being insufficient. And this view of life is a life which is associated with turmoil and depression. That people who think in this way often direct this way of thinking inward as well. The connection of genius to madness is a very old one. Now, the authors talk about the head girl. Before we get to that, a little more about genius. We have argued that genius is the characteristic outcome of the endogenous personality who is highly self-motivated. One of the most obvious and striking things about genius is that there used to be a lot of geniuses and major geniuses, and now there are very few. The research in human accomplishment by Charles Murray, which is broadly confirmed by others, indicates that genius in recent centuries has been essentially a phenomenon of the European population, including the diaspora of Europeans to other parts of the world. It seems that in Europe, and only in and around Europe and among its diaspora population, were the conditions necessary for the evolution of the endogenous personality, who combines both very high general intelligence and the inner-oriented personality type. In England and later elsewhere in Europe and from the Middle Ages onwards, there was a tremendous concentration of major world historical geniuses and of major breakthroughs which came thick and fast and interacted in a synergistic fashion to trigger first an agricultural or agrarian and then industrial revolution accelerating from about 1700 and taking off about 1800. There are a number of reasons to think that intelligence is in decline, and this has become more and more evident from the middle of the 20th century until it is now difficult to deny, since there are very few acknowledged geniuses at all and some fields without any. This is despite a much larger population and much better facilities and opportunities. Well, I wonder about the much better facilities and opportunities. Let's look at climate change. The scientific consensus is that it is real and it is caused by man. Where does the money come from for science? Well, it comes from government, directly or indirectly. There are no gentlemen scientists anymore. And so scientific research, it parrots back government policies or proposed government policies, because if it does not, then the funding dries up. Ooh, are there any controversial scientists out there? How could you be a controversial scientist? It's a contradiction in terms. The authors continue, it's not just the number of geniuses that have declined, but their quality. So, for example, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was Clark, Maxwell, Einstein, Rutherford, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Planck, Bohr, Dirac, and so on and so forth. But 100 years later, there are only a few elderly geniuses left. In biology, biochemistry, which had its golden era, as recently as the middle of the 20th century, there are now only a handful of elderly greats left over from those days, such as the American James Watson, the co-discoverer of DNA, and Sidney Brenner, the South African experimental geneticist. The same picture can be seen even more starkly in classical music. The 19th century had Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, Mendelssohn, Chopin, Debussy, Berlioz, Weber, Verdi, Wagner, Mahler, Brahms. The list just goes on and on. In the early 20th century, there were a few leftovers in Schoenberg, Stravinsky, and Richard Strauss, and then nothing. I don't know, I would add Philip Glass to that list. But I want to give you the two main reasons for the disappearance of classical music as a living form is one, it became captured by the Academy. That, instead of finding patrons, musicians like Haydn and Mozart were liveried servants and not very high up in the ranking of liveried servants. And then they went to the capitalist mode, so primitive capitalism, where they found noblemen, willing to sponsor the publication of music or to pay for concerts. And then you see serious music becoming broadly popular in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. And then the Academy got its hooks into it, where no, we're all going to teach you to compose 12-tone because that's what everyone does now. Don't do anything different, or you will be dropped. You will be unpersoned. Don't be daring, because being daring is dangerous. The second thing that happened was the disappearance of humane bourgeois society. Classical music was supported by a large audience of middle-class people. I would say, upper middle class, and some lower middle-class people too. And partly for the reason that they thought that they should, that this was demanded of them, but also for genuine reasons that people now had the opportunity to take pleasure in things which they had the means as well. Previously, only the aristocracy or members of the church had these advantages. So beautiful music was available to all, and so members of the middle class flocked to it. Well, the middle class has been hammered by economic change, but the middle class no longer feels that it has any kind of civilizing mission, or no longer feels any kind of responsibility, that, sitting down in a chair and listening to a piece of music that lasts for half an hour, what would possibly be the point of that? It's not interactive, is it? Where is the me in it? Appreciating art in such a way. It's one-way communication. Essentially, you sit down, you shut up, and listen, and that's anti-democratic. So we see that the bourgeois has been replaced by radical Democrats. Dutton and Charlton continue that they talk about a striking slowing of simple reaction times from the time of Francis Galton in the late 19th century until the 20th century. But then they come up with the great enemy of the genius, which is the head girl. It's a British term from British schools. The stereotypical head girl is an all-rounder, performs extremely well in all school subjects, and has a very high grade point average, as it is termed in the USA. She is excellent at sports, captaining all the major teams. She is also pretty, popular, sociable, and well-behaved. The head girl will probably be a big success in life in whatever terms being a big success happens to be framed. So she might, in some places and times, make a good marriage and do a good job of raising a family. In another time and place, she might go on to a top-notch college and get a top-notch job and pursue a glamorous and infertile lifestyle of serial monogamy with desirable mates. But the head girl is not and cannot be a creative genius. The genius is pretty much everything the head girl is not. He or she is lopsided in his abilities, truly excellent at some things or maybe just one thing. He is either hopeless or bored by many others. He won't work hard for long periods at things he does not want to do. He will not gravitate to the prestige areas of life and cannot or will not do the networking necessary to get on. The head girl can never be a creative genius because she does what other people want by the standards they most value. She will work harder and at a higher standard in doing whatever it is that social pressure tells her to do. And she will do this, but whatever social standards prevail, only more thoroughly. Meanwhile, the creative genius will do what he does because he must. The head girl will not want to alienate potentially powerful allies. Meanwhile, the creative genius is indifferent or hostile to the opinions of others so long as he knows he is right. The head girl is great to have around. Everyone thinks she is wonderful. Meanwhile, the creative genius is at best a person who divides opinion strongly in both directions, at worst often a signed-up member of the awkward squad. I could mention Richard Wagner in this respect. Now, we all know who he is today, but for decades he was a little regarded man, constantly on the run from the police and from his creditors. If it were not for his father-in-law, Franz Liszt, he would have had almost no presentations of his operas. But Richard Wagner believed that he was the future of opera, that he was creating a new form of opera, that music would be seen in the future as before Wagner and after Wagner, and more than that, a theater built to his exact specifications would be built under his direction to perform only his operas. And so, of course, people thought that he was mad. But guess what? All of those things came true. Now, Richard Wagner was very much a member of the awkward squad. It seems like a difficult, impossible person to get along with, but such is the way of geniuses. And more on the suppression of genius. Creative people always have difficult personalities, and conversely, nice people with conscientious, obedient, reliable personalities are not creative. This means that institutions, employers, and patrons must tolerate the difficulties of endogenous personalities if they want those things done that only geniuses can do. Most of the time, potential geniuses are a nuisance, but there are times when such people are essential. However, in order to do things, geniuses have to find themselves a job or a university place or a patron. In other words, the difficult short-term decision to appoint, tolerate, and perhaps even reward an asocial endogenous personality instead of a conscientious and popular head girl type might be made by an individual who knew the nature and potential of the endogenous personality because perhaps he was himself an endogenous personality. But nowadays, such decisions are usually made by committee vote by officials and bureaucrats who are themselves usually the opposite of geniuses, and done according to guidelines and protocols, standard procedures, and an attitude of risk minimalization will almost invariably tend to exclude geniuses who are nearly always lopsided with weaknesses as well as strengths. Indeed, modern institutions are not even trying to select primarily by intelligence, the reality of which they often deny, but are instead implicitly, by the nature of their evaluations and also by explicitly stated policies, selecting on other grounds, especially for the head girl personality, the conscientious, empathetic, socially integrated all-rounders. Modern society, of course, is run by head girls of both sexes, plus a smattering of charming or charismatic psychopaths. Hence, there is no assigned place for the creative genius. Modern colleges aim at recruiting head girls, so do universities, so does science, so do the arts, so does the mass media, so does the legal profession, so does medicine, so does the military. And in doing so, they filter out and exclude even the possibility of creative genius. I remember reading in Chesterton's biography of St. Thomas Aquinas, The Dumb Ox, that Aquinas found himself at the dinner table of the king, King Louis IX, who was later made a saint. This wasn't a private dinner. There were many people. And the king or some other noble was carrying on, and they were all shaken, startled, because there was this tremendous hammering on the table. And Aquinas said, "That will settle the heresy of the Manichees." You see, he hadn't been paying attention to anything that was going on at the dinner. He hadn't been listening to any of the conversation. He had no interest in taking part in the conversation. He was working out a theological problem in my head. Luckily, St. Louis tolerated him. And in the past, there was a far higher tolerance for people like that. I mean, I just imagine, you could come up with your own list of geniuses. And, well, would you want this person associated with your institution? And the head girl type says, yeah, he makes some pretty awkward comments from time to time. Yeah, so? But of course, we've seen, Linus Torvalds, that guy, he's finished now because of some weird things that he said, because we can't have that, because we can't have any weirdness, which is strange in a society which seems to valorize weirdness, or so it claims, more than anything else. But you see that the perverse has become the normal now, so being non-perverse is actually being weird now. How does this person fit in? Female-led societies are all about consensus, whereas in male-led societies, there's an understanding that we leave some people alone because that's the way that we get the best results. But of course, this begins in childhood. It begins in school, where teachers are almost all female now. And for several decades now, we've been doping young boys with powerful drugs because apparently they're too twitchy. They just don't make female teachers comfortable. So we're going to rewire their brains such that female teachers don't have to deal with a certain amount of discomfort. I'm convinced that in the future, and in the not so distant future, that historians and social scientists are going to look at the Ritalin phenomenon, and they're going to regard it in the same way that they now regard the phenomenon of electroshock or lobotomies. How could they have done things like this? But I'll end on this note, that science, for the longest time, told us the lobotomies were just great. I mean, why would you object to scooping out someone's brain, or frying the brain with electricity, or poisoning it with insulin? Oh, science said, look, these are all PhDs here, and they all say that this is correct. So you don't want to be anti-science, do you? And I talked about Semmelweis before, who was the physician in Vienna who discovered a way to stop having, I don't know, every second woman and child die in childbirth by getting physicians to wash their hands. And where's the theory behind this? Well, he didn't have a theory, and he was also a Jew, and people were jealous of him, and they ran him out of town, effectively, and he ended his life in disgrace. He was a genius, certainly. But yeah, that's all I have for today. If you enjoyed any of this, I would ask you to please subscribe to my channel. I will be back on the air at 4 o'clock Pacific time, 7 o'clock Eastern time. It's Theater Thursday. We're talking about a very entertaining and vivacious movie from Jonathan Glazer tomorrow called Sexy Beast. The Book Club Friday, we're talking about George and Whedon Grossmith's The Diary of a Nobody. If you would like to donate to my show, my PayPal account is at kevin_grace@hotmail.com. I thank you all most sincerely for listening, for watching, and I hope that you all have a fine evening. Good night.